We all crave it, and we all look for it in different places. And let's be honest, we have looked for it in some rather unusual places during this pandemic. We've hoped for toilet roll and for bread, for diesel, and now apparently for pigs in blankets. And of course we approach hope differently, don't we? Some of us are going to hope for the best and we'll cross our fingers and toes, and then some of us will hope for the worst so that we're not left disappointed. If only we could approach hope confidently, even in the midst of a pandemic, having the assurance that we can hold on to that hope, that it won't slip through our fingers, even when the circumstances of life become really hard to bear. Well, we're really glad that you could join us tonight, whether you're listening at home with friends or whether you are out at a church building. We're so glad that you were able to spend time thinking about this idea of hope. And we challenge you tonight to dare to believe in a hope that can stand the test of time as we look at the Bible and the claims of Jesus Christ. And to help us do that, we are going to have Becca, who's going to speak to us tonight, Becca Whittaker. Becca is a wife and a mum, and she is a daughter and a sister. She's an entrepreneur. She's a crazy plant lover. I can say all these things because, of course, you can't interrupt me. But Becca is also really passionate at helping people to live out the challenge of being a Christian in the ordinary things of life. And I can't wait to hear what she has to say to us.
Well, hello ladies. Thank you so much for giving me your attention for the next few minutes. I want to start this evening by asking you to cast your minds back in time with me. Not too far back, thankfully, but I want us to think back to the early parts of the pandemic. I want you to think of April 2020. And the reason for that is because it was about April 2020 when I think many of us did something that we had never, ever done before. For me, it was on the 11th of April 2020, as I was stood outside of a Sainsbury's supermarket in Newport, and for the first time in my life, I put a mask on my face. It was white and thick and scratchy and uncomfortable, and as I was stood in this queue outside of Sainsbury's, hoping that I was going to be able to go inside and buy a joint of lamb for our Easter Sunday lunch, I put a mask on my face. It felt weird having it on, and it made me feel nervous. I wonder if you remember the first time that you put a mask on your face during the pandemic. They've become so second nature to us now that we don't even think about it. But can you remember the first time you did it? Little firsts like that are examples of how this pandemic has changed our lives. And we could name a dozen of them, couldn't we? The first time that we heard Boris on the TV announcing the message to please stay at home. The first of those daily briefings that we tuned in for. The first of the daily death counts. The first time that we realised that we weren't going to be able to move around as freely, that we weren't going to be able to hug our families. But not all of those firsts were bad, were they? The first vaccine that you got in your arm, the first time that you got to hug that loved one that you hadn't seen for over a year. 2021 has been labelled the year that we hugged again. Those pandemic firsts will stay with us, won't they? Looking back over the last 20 months, our lives have changed in a lot of ways, haven't they? And I want us to just spend a few minutes this evening reflecting on what it is that has kept us going through what for most of us has been the most challenging thing we've ever faced. So let me ask you, what has kept you going through the pandemic? I want to suggest that in one form or another, hope is what has kept us all going. Hope for the future. Hope that things will get back to normal. Hope that one day all of this will just be a distant memory. Hope is what has kept us going through those dark days of the pandemic. But what is your hope in? Back at the beginning of 2020, at the start of all of this, what did you put your confidence in as you looked ahead? Well, maybe for you it was your health. Do you remember how in the early days we were told that our chances of getting badly ill were directly linked to our age and our health? How healthy we all were suddenly became either a source of great confidence or a source of great fear and anxiety. We were told that it was important that we do daily exercise, and I was one of the thousands of people across the country who decided to take up running in the pandemic. In fact, I went for my first ever run on a Thursday night, just after I'd put my 3 kids to bed. I got my gear on, my leggings, I strapped my phone to my arm to track my progress, and I headed out of the house just before 8 p.m. Well, it took less than a minute for me to be completely breathless and bent over halfway around the block. And I noticed as I was sort of trying to jog along that a lot of people seemed to be coming out of their houses to stand at the ends of their driveways. And I sort of staggered on, desperately trying not to throw up the spaghetti bolognese that I'd had for dinner that evening. And to my horror, all of these people started to clap. And some of them even were starting to bang saucepans. I had managed to time my first ever run to coincide perfectly with the clapping for the NHS that we all used to do on a Thursday evening. Do you remember that? One of the worst mistakes of my life. I decided at that point that the best thing to do was to hide in a bush until everyone had gone back in. And I sort of skulked home, determined never ever to go for a run again. Do you remember the times that we went out and clapped for the NHS? I think especially at the beginning of the pandemic, back in sort of February 2020, quite a lot of us, if we're honest, were anchoring our hope of getting through the pandemic in the NHS, weren't we? We clapped for them to honour their hard work, their sacrifice, and we tried to do our bit by staying at home in hope that everything would then be okay. We put our rainbows, our thank you signs in the window, and we rooted our hope in the NHS to keep us safe. And of course, the NHS did do a wonderful job and still are doing a wonderful job. But people still got sick, didn't they? The NHS was still pushed to the brink of breaking point. And for many of us, our loved ones still died. As amazing as our NHS is, it was never going to be able to bear all of our hopes of getting through this pandemic. So, as time moved on, we hoped in other things as well. For most of us, we placed a huge amount of hope in our government, in the scientists. People talked about being led by the science, and these previously anonymous government scientists were suddenly thrust to the forefront in front of the cameras at these news conferences. And we put our hope in our leaders, that they would be able to navigate a path for us through this pandemic and make good decisions for our good. And as time went on, we placed our hope in the pharmaceutical companies, didn't we? The ones who were actually working on a vaccine. Our hope was in a breakthrough. In conversations with people on the street, we would say, hopefully, when we find a vaccine, all of this will be able to be put behind us, we'll be able to get back to normal. Hope in the vaccine was a strong one, wasn't it? Do you remember how you felt when they first announced that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine had been produced? I remember myself feeling just waves of relief at the idea that we finally had hope of this all being over. And of course, it is wonderful that we do now have effective vaccines. But do you remember how not long after the vaccines were being rolled out, all of those questions emerged about the side effects? Those cases of blood clots? The vaccines that we had hoped, were they actually going to deliver? And even now, after most of us have had 2 vaccines, we're now being told that we need our boosters. You see, the vaccines are wonderful things, aren't they? But are they really going to prove to be the lasting, solid ground for us to hope in? As we look ahead now, and we look ahead to the winter, and we see the high rates of COVID in Wales, We hear Mark Drakeford talk of restrictions now so that we can save Christmas. Is the science really proving to be that steadfast anchor for our hope as we look ahead? We're at a strange point in the pandemic now, aren't we? We're trying to sort of navigate this new normal, but we've always got this nagging thing in our heads. Are we ever really going to be done with all of this? But maybe that's not really you. Maybe you're feeling optimistic. Surely, we won't need to wear these masks and show our vaccine passports forever, right? Let's just hope for the best. Let's just press on. We hear quite a lot of that as well, don't we? A kind of vague sense of optimism. But that vague sense of optimism, that idea that let's just, put one foot in front of the other, let's think positive, hope for the best, that isn't really hope, is it? You see, I think there's a big difference between optimism and hope. Ultimately, optimism is just a wish. It's just sort of a vague hope that things might somehow all just work themselves out. In the end, that is just a wish. It's not really something grounded in reality, in solid facts. Optimism is different to hope. So what is hope then? Well, putting our hope in something means that we put our confidence for the future in it. Hope is a future-orientated thing, isn't it? Now, we can put our hope in all sorts of things. Hope in our achievements, maybe your job or your career. Or perhaps you put your hope in your financial security. We think to ourselves, okay, if I have enough money, I'll be okay. Or maybe for you, you put your hope in relationships, your spouse, your family, your children, your friends, the idea of finding the one. I'll be all right if I have them, we think. Or, we've spoken about our health this evening already, haven't we? Maybe as long as you think you have your health, we think we'll be okay. What is your hope for the future rooted in this evening? How would you fill in the blank to this sentence? As long as I have ... I'll be okay. What is it for you? What is your hope in? Whatever it is, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we know if those things will prove strong enough to bear all that life throws at us? Will those things really stand the weight of all that we go through in this life? Well, to decide that, I want to offer you a little litmus test for our hopes this evening. We can know if our hopes will last and if they'll hold up to all that the future has for us by asking one simple question of them. Does what we're hoping in hold up at a graveside? Does what we're hoping in hold up at a graveside? Now, that's a big question, isn't it? And it probably feels like quite an intense question for a Thursday evening. But that is ultimately what this boils down to. Does what I have placed my confidence for the future in stand strong at a graveside? To put it another way, does it hold up when I am faced with death? Now, the reason that I ask that question of our hopes is because death is the ultimate thief of hope. Few things bring the realities of life more clearly into focus than when we are stood next to a grave. I think if nothing else, the pandemic has really shown that to us, hasn't it? Maybe you've even experienced it personally. You've attended a funeral in the last couple of years and experienced that crushing feeling of standing at a graveside and wondering, is this it? Is that really the end? Facing death forces us to question where our hopes really lie. And the sad truth is that death crushes so many of the things that we are tempted to put our hope in. If we root our hope in people, in relationships, in our loved ones, then in the end, standing at their graveside crushes that hope. If we hope in science, in medicine, in health, then few things crush us more than standing at the graveside of someone we thought medicine would be able to cure. Or if we place our hope in money, few things prove its futility more than realising that we just can't take it with us. And no matter how much of it we have, we can't prevent death coming for us. Death is the ultimate hope crusher. Does anything hold up against it? Can any hope stand that test? You see, that's the litmus test for real, lasting hope. Does it hold up at a graveside? Well, I want to invite you tonight to consider a hope that does hold up when faced with death. I want you to consider with me now the only hope in this world that claims to have gone through death and come out of it alive. In the Bible, in a book called 1 Peter, it says these words. It says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." Now, I don't know how much you know about Christianity this evening, but the biggest claim of Christianity, of the Bible, is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And this is a claim that is rooted in history, in real, solid facts, in a real physical man. A man born in Bethlehem, and this is attested by all credible historians. The fact is that you will not find a credible historian who denies that Jesus was real, that he was tried by the Romans, and that he was crucified on a hill outside of Jerusalem. Those are just the simple facts of history. And history also shows us that since Jesus' death, millions of people across hundreds of years have rooted their lives, not just in the fact that he died, but in the claim that he rose again. The verse that I just read claims it. Did you notice? It's talking about a living hope which is offered to us because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Jesus died and he was placed in a grave, but his grave wasn't the end of the story. His friends and followers gathered around his graveside just like we do with our friends. But the staggering claim of the Bible is that 3 days later, 3 days after he died, Jesus' friends found his grave to be empty because he had risen to life again. His friends stood at his graveside, but rather than have their hopes crushed by death like we do when we stand at a graveside, Jesus' friends saw firsthand that he had beaten death. He had won the battle that every other human being has lost. He rose again, and it is because of that victory over death that he now invites us to put our hope in him. If we set our hope in the person of Jesus, then we get to share and experience the only hope that lasts even when faced with death. But how does that actually work? Well, I want you to imagine that this piece of black cloth represents death. And this piece of wool represents us. Our lives, our strength to conquer death. You see, in and of ourselves, when we come up against death, we have no power to pierce it, do we? We've got no way to make it through. Death simply stops us in our tracks. All of our hopes stopped. We have no way through. But in comparison to us, Jesus is like a needle. His power as God's Son meant that he could do what none of us can. You see, he pierces a way through death and comes out the other side of it when he rises again 3 days later. And he is the only one who has ever done this in the whole of history. So if we place our hope in Jesus, then his victory over death becomes ours. Our lives get joined to him, a bit like the wool threaded through the needle. By placing our hope in him, we can have confidence that when we face death, because he has gone first, he will draw us through it to life beyond. Hope that conquers even the grave. Hope that crushes death itself. That is what a hope rooted in the person of Jesus offers. It is the only hope that stands the test of a graveside. Jesus' resurrection, the fact that he claims to have come back from the dead, that is what all of his other claims hang on. Jesus claimed some extraordinary things about himself. He claimed to be the only source of true life, the only way for us to come to know God and be made right with him again. Jesus claimed that we'd all sinned and that we need God's forgiveness in order to be saved. And he also claimed that he was the only source of that forgiveness. Jesus claims that if we put our hope in him, then we get to share in the victory that he won over death when he rose again. And belief in Jesus, hoping in him, that doesn't just affect the way that we actually approach death ourselves, it also transforms the whole of our lives today. It means that even in the uncertainty of something like a global pandemic, we can know his help as we navigate this strange new normal. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could find a hope like that? A hope that meant that you didn't need to fear the future as you look ahead. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you really did find a hope that gave you peace and stability in our constantly changing world? Wouldn't it be wonderful if you found a hope that meant standing at a graveside no longer filled you with dread, but rather filled you with hope of life beyond death? That is what is on offer to you this evening if you choose to place your hope in Jesus. So I want to ask you now, how will you respond to this invitation? Will you accept Jesus' offer to come to him, to find forgiveness in him and experience a hope that transforms your whole life? You see, even if you've still got questions, one thing can't be denied. If the claims of Jesus are true, then they change everything, don't they? Just imagine for a moment knowing a hope like this. Imagine the effect that it would have on your life. Surely at the very least it's worth investigating it further, isn't it? Can I encourage you? Don't put this off any longer. None of us know what tomorrow holds. None of us know what is just around the corner in this pandemic. But this offer to hope in Jesus is available to you now. It's available to all who come and put their hope in him. So the question is, will you?
Thank you, Becca. That was just brilliant. I love that image of the needle threading the wool, that closeness, that attachment, that hope of being drawn through together. And of course, the idea that if we place our hope in Jesus, we can have confidence of being drawn through death to life beyond. If that's something you already know, then enjoy the victory. Praise God for Jesus. If that's something that you have never thought of before, or an offer that you've never considered, then why don't you chat to the person who's brought you tonight? Perhaps ask them to explain the living hope that has transformed their life. I'm sure they'll be delighted to talk you through it. Or perhaps you could study with friends the eyewitness accounts of Jesus in the Bible. Or you could even Google a church and perhaps see if they run a course like Christianity Explored, where you can explore further the claims of Jesus Christ in the Bible. And as Becca said tonight, wouldn't it be wonderful if you found a hope that gave you peace and stability in a constantly changing world? Well, you can, and it is wonderful. So enjoy the rest of your night, but don't forget the challenge.